We start, Professor Gary Dymski is a professor and chair in applied economics, University of Leeds. Gary has contributed a lot to this literature. He was in University of California, Riverside, and he founded the center, Policy Research Center for the University of California, Sacramento, the whole University of California system, and has done some very, very interesting work on race, ethnicity, gender, and finance is his kind of shadow banking system and current credit crisis. Has contributed a lot to the literature as well as policy making. Is right in the European policy making bodies, trying to bring up a change. Is fighting from inside, as we say, and we are grateful to him. When I asked him about this, and very enthusiastically he said, "Yes, I will come." And with all his commitments, prior commitments, he was able to give us time. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for your time, and I hope we'll continue to enjoy this summer school, or winter school. Sorry, summer school. Without further ado, I'll give it to Gary, and be the same time, 1 hour 30 minutes, and after that we'll have the review and discussion session for the entire day. Okay. Again, same thing applies. If you have absolutely pressing questions, ask. If you can't hold it and leave it to the discussion, you can. Thanks. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is this thing on?
Yeah, it's on.
All right, good. Thanks, Raghav. And I'm going to stand here because I've got a clock I can watch, and it disciplines me nicely. Here's our agenda. We're going to do 4 talks spread over 3 sessions. And so this is huge, right? But basically what we're going to do is we're going to go through, in a sense, the logics of classical and Keynesian. I was really inspired by what Dr. Badauri brought to us, and I wanted to put what he said into some kind of context that will especially make sense to those of you who are coming out of or experiencing some of the master's and PhD programs, just to kind of connect some of the dots. And then you can see that we're going to go all the way through into questions of financial regulation. We're going to talk about power and finance, shadow banking, many things. This first lecture, we're going to cover the first 6 topics. If we don't quite get through, then we'll pick up one of them tomorrow. But I tried to organize this so that we can have basically just a step-by-step. Okay, so we're going to start with basically actually looking at the classical versus Keynesian macro logics. And since you were given such rich contextual information and literary sources by Professor Badauri, I thought that I would follow that up a little bit and to place it into the proper context, because I wanted to start by talking about classical versus Keynesian, and actually that becomes an invitation to realize that we should give ourselves a proper historical frame. Much of what we saw in the work of Raghav and Amit is linked to the contributions of Michal Kalecki, and basically that in turn picks up Marx, and kind of and then Kalecki is working on ideas that he picks up a little bit from Rosa Luxemburg, and these were ideas on the independence of demand and supply, which together with his interest in the material conditions of reproduction give him the special power that you saw in Professor Badauri's talk. He brings in both the Keynesian insight about aggregate demand and supply and the independence of aggregate demand, but then brings in as well the story about the classicals. And just to say that basically, and it's clear, I was writing this actually yesterday, and I think by the end of today's conversation, Professor Badauri showed us very well the independence of demand and supply in his frame. And just to say that in turn, it's just important to realize, if you are interested in following the ideas of Marx and Luxemburg, and for that matter, Kalecki, and to put Keynes into that framework, I would just recommend there's an excellent book by Maurice Daub that really does the work of, at an accessible but sophisticated level, going through the history of thought. And one thing that I wanted to emphasize that in what we heard from Professor Badauri is the fact that it's implicit in what he brings us and in what this tradition brings us, that distribution is socially determined, not technologically determined. This insight is so fundamental and so important and so contested in economics that it deserves to be really highlighted. And the fact that basically that for those of us who see economic outputs as always socially determined, the fact that this is erased in later iterations of economic theory brings us in mind of the subtitle of Dobbs' book, which is Ideology and Economic Theory. Okay, so basically to say, now we're going to get on a trajectory because that group of theorists that, John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, could be called the classical approach to, or the political economy approach. But in the 1870s, three economists, and this is actually right out of Dobbs' book, invented the marginal revolution, where they basically said that rather than thinking about economic value and wages and so on and distribution as coming out of social determinations, they tried to pull it out of individual determinations. The entire configuration of economic relations is seen as derived from preferences, endowments, and technology. Wages then now are understood not as a bargain between labor and capital, but instead as equal to the marginal contribution of the last quantum of labor that's deployed with a given stock of capital. So the distribution of income is redefined as something that's technical, not social. And this is codified then when Marshall makes a step and at 1890 releases his textbook, which is called Principles of Economics. It's the first of this term, economics, appears as opposed to political economy. And basically, at this point, we have to recognize that Keynes gives us some mischief just at this moment. Because what Keynes does is, first of all, as noted, he's a co-discoverer of the principle of aggregate demand. Kalecki gets there first in Polish. But basically, there's this notion that aggregate demand and supply, which are co-determined in the neoclassical approach, the marginalist approach, are challenged by the Keynes and Kalecki approaches in which aggregate demand is in the lead. Now, in characterizing his opponents, and keep in mind that Keynes was kind of debating with people in Cambridge and Oxford who were his debating partners, he wants to put everybody who's in the marginalist tradition into one bucket, and he calls that the classical school. Now, he doesn't necessarily use the word Keynesian economics, but he certainly didn't mind that people went with that direction. And in so doing, he gives us a characterization because he's in dialogue with these, what we would now call neoclassical economists. He suppresses everything about, it's not just that, it's also him, I suppose. He suppresses everything about the material conditions of production and the social basis of wage setting. All that's set aside because he's got two big targets, which we're going to come to momentarily. And he ignores this social dimension and material basis of economic reproduction. So this name classical sticks. And Milton Friedman uses it. And then by the 70s, 60s and 70s, you have this whole panoply of people, most of whom have gotten Nobel Prizes by now. Lucas, Sargent, Wallace, Prescott, Barrow, the so-called New Classical Economics. This is a reassertion of the view, the New Classical, so they embraced this notation, and in so doing, they reassert the importance of the general equilibrium approach in which any proper equilibrium will be defined, any proper model will have at its heart an equilibrium that's reducible to preferences, endowments, and technology. Even the new Keynesians accept this. We'll get to that in the next page, but Roger Farmer, who certainly fancies himself a new Keynesian, writes in this 1993 book, The Future of Macroeconomics is as a branch of applied general equilibrium theory. And so that's kind of the way they rolled. People then who wanted to retain some role for government policy, used rigidities, transaction costs, missing information, some of the things that Dr. Badouri was talking about this morning, things that would shift you from a first best to a second best, at best equilibrium situation, as the core of their thinking, of their claim to move away from a pure equilibrium in a very efficient way to a less than full equilibrium. So this is the new Keynesian model. You're in worlds of second best equilibrium, and basically in those worlds, now remember, the independence of demand and supply is banished from the classical model, and it's banished from the new Keynesian models. Secondly, there's no discussion of the social distribution of income, the social determinants of things. And thirdly, they banish fundamental uncertainty, which we'll get to momentarily. And so whilst we do have people like Stiglitz and Krugman, who are card-carrying members of the new Keynesian crowd, who are broadly Keynesian in their popular writings, when it comes down to doing their formal models, they never reintroduce, they never challenge this kind of ideology disguised as a model of the economy, in which pretends that everything that's out there would be best coordinated if markets were just left to themselves. And just to say now that's the end of the kind of bridge in a way, and now we're going to go back to the old school classical model as Keynes was setting it up in his general theory, just to show you the difference and just to kind of launch my talk. Really simply, and I want to show you this in part because as we contend with people who are basically committed to various kinds of ideologies that are pro-market, it's important for us to realize that this classical model gives you a self-enclosed logic that explains everything on its own terms. People who buy this logic are fully committed and consistent when they make claims that make no sense if you're coming from a Keynesian viewpoint. And it's important to know that. Those of you who are coming from outside economics might find it shocking or surprising that any science could be so impoverished as not to use empirical evidence as a basis of rejecting or accepting hypotheses, but that would lead us into a discussion of econometrics and econometric testing, which Amit has already mentioned, and which is the subject of another discussion. But here's a simple model. We start with right technology, a production function. We start with a demand for labor that comes from the first derivative of this production function, in which outcome comes from the application through available technology that's smooth and well-behaved of N and K, labor and capital. Labor supply comes right out of preferences without elaborating. People supply labor and they consider labor versus leisure. They think about what they can buy, what goods they can buy with the labor they do, and they maximize all of that. And we have an equilibrium, and it looks like this. Now, the point I want to make here is that at this point, we're done. We already know what GDP is. We haven't said a word about aggregate demand. Demand is nowhere in sight, and it doesn't need to be in sight. So right there's just no consideration. It's not part of the equation. So when you hear like Mr. Cameron talking about we need to cut business taxes, we need to get rid of impediments, we need to reduce the minimum wage and all these other kinds of things, he's coming from a logic that's this logic. Now you can say, he's seduced, and you can say it's political, and we would say, yeah, that's right, it is political, and is he seduced, or is he representing a set of class interests that wants to hide behind this view of reality? Well, that's for, I guess, his psychoanalyst to know. But as for us, we have to deal with it. Now, when there's unemployment like this, of course, the obvious thing in this model is the unemployment is this red line shown where basically we have the amount of people wishing to work at NS greater than the amount of people that are desired to work that will be hired at ND. And that gap between ND star and NS star is the unemployment, the amount of people unemployed. And basically the solution here is very simple. You cut wages. And this was something that Pigou, in several books who preceded Keynes at Cambridge, emphasized. Now, just to say, let's move then to the second parts of the model. The model is separable, and to use the term of Andreas Papandreou back when he was economist. So you already have in the first part of the model the equilibrium values for Y, N, and the real wage. It should be W. I got rid of the P here for this. Sorry for that. And basically, now the question is, well, how is the output used and who's going to buy it? And basically what we have here is a situation where, just to say, first, all output gets paid out as income. Wages, profits, interest, and rent. Now, that depiction is suppressed in the Keynesian approach, is emphasized in the Kaleckian approach. But it's a step, because basically all wage, as this goes right to the heart of the kind of things that Amit was talking about, what do you do with your wage? What do you do with your profit, et cetera? Of course, understanding that is the key to unfolding some of the insights that we saw about the financial sector in a macro model setting. And basically, we're going to go in a Keynesian spirit right to the uses of income. So we're going to, like whether or not you're earning profits or you're earning wages, your choices are to consume, C, to save, S, or to pay taxes, T, leaving aside the foreign sector for the moment. And basically, on the other side is the demand. Who buys the GDP? It can be government, it can be investment, and here, of course, thinking of investment in a proper macroeconomic frame, that is to say, the expansion of plant and equipment, the increase in plant and equipment to enhance productive capacity, and then G, government. If we put the math together and simplify, we get this equation that's third from the bottom, I guess second from the bottom, and if we then define, and we're going to get to a picture, but basically note that what we've got here is we've got essentially the interest rate, which is going to moderate between whether consumers save or invest, or save or consume, and how much investment is done. And we're going to get down to this so-called loanable funds market. Now, this market is crucial, and if you don't believe me about Krugman, go to his level 1 macroeconomics textbook and see how he introduces the credit market, and you'll see it's loanable funds. It's chapter 5 or 6, if I remember. I was really shocked. I thought, Paul Krugman, really, loanable funds? Come on now. It was really a shame I had 560 freshmen in the room, and I had to start fighting with my textbook. Not a happy moment. So I thought, you kids don't know anything yet, but you know what? It's a throwdown. Come on, Krugman. You've got to do better than that. But why? Because basically, if it's a situation like this, then basically what we have is that, okay, so what you got going on here is just stylistically, and I think this is the Star Wars moment here. Basically, here's our people, and the things got rather fouled up, so sorry for that. We've got the supply of bonds. Oh, they sure did. Okay, this is the bond supply curve right here. This is basically either firms or government supplying bonds, wishing finance, basically looking for finance to either fund a government deficit or to basically fund investment. On the other side is the demand for bonds, and essentially, so sorry for that, this curve here and this curve here, if they were well drawn, would be matches. Like at every interest rate, this plus this would equal the same amount that's left over after these people pay their taxes. And actually, that's a mistake too, I forgot T. And so basically, what you have here is you pick an amount, and there's a level of interest at which there's exactly the rate of interest people are willing to pay to have this amount of savings, which in turn is adequate to fund that amount of government deficit plus investment. And again, sorry that I always have trouble with these figures on PowerPoint, but there's our equilibrium point. And just to show you that the hostility to government is built right into this model. Here's a way to see it. Just note that we can take that amount there of the demand for funds, or which is to say that, let me say it differently, the demand for financing, which means the supply of bonds, and we can chop it into two pieces that kind of look kind of purple up there. That's kind of funky. Okay, so the purple is basically investment demand, and then the bit that's above that, between that and the curve, that's your government borrowing need. And notice that it wouldn't actually be flat like this, but just for simplicity, let's draw it flat. And of course, what I'm going to show you right now is what happens if the government deficit goes up. Well, here's what happens. Well, first of all, here's your first equilibrium. And so we draw that line, but then basically the increase in government spending is this shift up to the red line. So notice that we're going to go from that equilibrium to that equilibrium. And when we do that, what's going to happen is that we're going to have basically an amount of investment that was at a certain level will be replaced by a lower level. So basically, government squeezes out the private sector and initiative, and it's a bad thing. So that all follows quite logically from this model. So government spending, to suppress government spending, the other part of the Cameron-Osborne agenda is very consistent with that vision of how they're going to save the economy. Now you can ask, we can say, well, is that all ideology or what? Well, it may or may not be, but that's basically where they're coming from. And, or is it political capture? And that's a question that, again, is off the table at this moment, although we can speculate. Now, Keynes makes two fundamental points. One is the independence and Amit already mentioned that contrary to Say's law, supply creates its own demand, we have this notion of the independence of aggregate demand. And furthermore, we have fundamental uncertainty coming in as the idea that basically people in making investment or in playing on financial markets that are going to finance investment don't know the future. And the further in the future they're planning to make commitments, the more that is a problem. He uses examples like the value of a railroad in 1970, and writing there in 1932, I suppose, or 34. And that kind of example illustrates the point. But basically, when we don't have a basis for making a probability assessment, then essentially we depend on our, the conventional beliefs of those that we trust. And in turn, those conventional beliefs are robust or fragile according to whether or not we have confidence in those that we believe. Basically, this is all to say that there is a kind of architecture of confidence and understanding that's very fallible and can fall apart in a minute when basically there's any kind of crisis. And when there's a crisis, people run to money. Now we're going to see that momentarily, but in fact, the run to money, killing investment and killing consumption, is something that basically we're going to see momentarily. And basically at that point, the government must step in. Now, show you first his critique of the unemployment model per se. So here is basically back to step one. Here's our unemployment situation. And essentially what his critique amounts to, in, using this simplistic model, is that basically a cut in wages, if we were to do it, will actually end up cutting, since we're cutting one of the components of aggregate demand, that in turn will lead to a reduced level of demand for goods and services, which in turn means that firms will need to hire less labor in order to take care of that, which in turn means that there will be less income. So essentially, what's going to happen is that we'll move to a situation where the demand for labor is going to fall. Now notice that here in the Keynesian version of this, it doesn't quite make sense as it was attached to that other curve, because there's a denial here that that curve is technologically based. Yeah, there's something in there, but there's social determination as well as technological determinants. And so that frees us from that notion that we have to look to that marginal utility and think, oh, actually, the way that lots of classical economists did, whenever there's a recession, they always talk about how workers get too lazy, people don't want to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically what we have here is a situation where if we were to do the wage cut and go down to that green wage or that W star, we would actually, because of the collapse of labor demand, recreate unemployment at a lower level. If we were to follow the same policy again and again and again, we would find ourselves in a downward loop, which would ultimately lead to debt deflation and other problems that were characteristic of the old school economies. Now, just to show you that what's missing in the depiction, in the loanable funds market depiction of what people do with their savings, is the fact that people are going to be sensitive to liquidity. They're going to need to have a place to run that's safe in certain circumstances. In the classical model, only a fool would keep their funds in money rather than savings, because you can earn a return on savings, whereas you earn nothing on money. Actually, you can think of the money market as a market in which you earn less than you earn on savings. And so we can depict it this way. I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the... S2, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, that's just the volume of savings, yeah, the volume of funds, either way, sorry for that. Basically, what we have is, people, in principle, in the short run market, because they're maybe afraid, or they're wanting flexibility, or they may be afraid, whereas the other market is the one that handles working capital and so on. And we got this margin here, which, as Keynes notes, he's got this very classic sentence: the habit of overlooking the relation of the rate of interest to hoarding may be a part of the explanation why interest has usually been regarded as the reward for not spending, whereas in fact it is the reward of not hoarding. So basically you get that higher RL, I guess, in that one scenario versus the RS, basically because you are willing to take the chance. But of course what happens is in good times, basically you could, suggesting with the green curve that you would, or the green and red curves, that what you would have, like the red curve could be euphoria period. The red shows that people who are providing savings, working with savings portfolios, would reduce maybe the savings in the short run and move into longer run funds. If firms in turn had, animal spirits, as was Keynes liked to mention, and others following him, then you would see that you'd have a higher equilibrium and everything would be good. And you have this kind of euphoria in the bond markets and so on. And so basically, in periods characterized by confidence, everything works well, and even speculation is rewarded. So investors shed liquidity, move toward yield, generating riskier, supporting riskier assets, and everything is going well. The opposite case, though, is one in which basically we see people running to liquidity, and in fact then business running away from investment. And there we'll see something. Now this curve doesn't quite work. I couldn't get it squared up and couldn't remember why I did that. But basically I couldn't find the original figure that I had done when I did these last year. But basically there's a squeeze here and people flee from risk. That part is missing, and that part is going to be crucial, especially when we come to the new phenomenon of shadow banking. Because shadow banking is going to create lots more connections between, in a sense, these two markets, lots more opportunities for people to run and fear when things go badly. Now part two. There's a famous meeting, the very ill Franklin Delano Roosevelt, surrounded by Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. And part two, the Breton Woods system. Now, we got to say this because this is a part of, this is a kind of reality-based lecture informed by theory. So, to some extent, you're getting one person's eye view of where we are. And one thing that we're going to see in this lecture is the emergence of the power in finance. And one reason why we have the power in finance are choices that were made in Bretton Woods, in setting up the Bretton Woods system, and then in what happened subsequently. Now, the two people, and these names were mentioned yesterday, there's John Maynard Keynes, looking very much like a wolf who is about to eat Harry Dexter White. And unfortunately, it didn't happen that way because basically there are two views. We've got a slide in a minute, but there was a view put forth of what to do by White representing the US on the left and Keynes on the right. And who won? Well, basically, there's an old adage, he who holds the gold makes the rules. And at that point in time, the US held the gold. They also held 55% of global production capacity coming out of World War II. And so we had this choice. Keynes' Bancor system. Now Keynes, right, working with the idea of the, well, Keynesian model, basically said that, we're going to have a situation where countries that are going to have surpluses on current account, they will have those surpluses because they will be in a situation in which basically they will be understimulating their economy. Countries with deficits are probably living beyond their means. So what you want to do, ideally, this is in the world before the energy crisis and before the carbon footprint problem or carbon issues, you would want to force those economies with surpluses to basically lever up, to stimulate their economies, to basically bring the world to a higher place of overall aggregate demand, pulling those deficit economies up, to their level and placing themselves in less of a surplus. The Breton Woods system that was established, though, and proposed by White took the opposite tact. That is to say that essentially, first of all, it'd be based on gold, but based on the dollar, and essentially, and this in turn was a system that was one in which basically there would be, the US would be in charge, we would have a confidence-based system, the dollar would be as good as gold, and the viability of any gold system depends, in fact, on the contradiction that those who trust the dollar, in this case, don't ask for it in gold because they like the fact that they don't ask for it means that it's sustainable. If they start asking for gold, then the thing will fall apart, the confidence will go. Now the US comes out of World War II, as noted, with strong capacity. And basically there's a problem there that details we need not get into, but essentially there's a question of sort of how do you work a system in which everybody's at the same level, in which the currencies are fixed to one another via a system of fixed exchange rates. And the answer is that, well, it's more problematic. You can't use devaluation or revaluation to adjust your position necessarily without breaking the rules of the system. And so there's got to be something to put dollars into the economy. That was the Marshall Plan, and then the Cold War with the USSR that basically incentivized the United States to be sure that there was enough aggregate demand in Europe and elsewhere to essentially keep people away from what was perceived as evil communist ideology. So we have, though, I want to point out, a world in which essentially global adjustment was not going to be done via a Bancor system that would ask people and nations that were in surplus to stimulate more. Instead, we had a system put in place which was rested on two sets of international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, notice the parallel construction here. Internationally overseen, US-dominated institutions. The first one focused on short-term adjustments. So rather than working to stimulate surplus economies, it would basically help deficit economies take care of their problems. So the surplus economies would not be policed upwards, the deficit economies would be policed downwards. If your exports are less than your imports, then if we cut your GDP, all things equal, and or change other balances, we're going to push down your imports until they equal your exports. So you have this situation in which basically we have a classical logic at work, policed by the IMF, in a world that is premised on and sometimes described as the golden age of capitalism. And basically, just to say that the fund is also limited, it's famous that the United States finally agreed to expand the capacity of the IMF, as problematic as the IMF is, which in part will change the representation at the table of who makes those decisions. Whether that makes a difference, we shall see. I had some discussions with IMF representatives at UNCTAD last month, and they're slow learners, let's just say that. So basically, what we have here is, these institutions that are essentially there to discipline the world. And now, just for a little comic relief, where are they located to ensure independence of judgment? Okay, let's go to Google Maps. Now, can you read this? Yeah, okay. 19th, and I think it's, 19th and H, yeah. Okay, there is the IMF. And You see the comment, they collapsed my country's economy. Now I must work 14 hours a day. So that's, okay, now there's about 3,000 economists there. And you ask, okay, so where's the World Bank, which is, after all, intending to build up the economies of the world in an independent way? Well, the answer is right next door. And in case you have a chance to go there, notice the number one comment. Excellent cafeteria. Yeah, that's it. So you should go there because they owe you something symbolically. Okay. So basically we have this, there's a contradictory system that depends on confidence in the dollar that's self-undermining, because essentially once the US is perceived as weakening, that system is going to go by the by. Essentially that weakening happens pretty fast. Europe and Asia recover. Germany and Japan emerge as powerhouses. The US goes into a deficit nation status. Britain struggles, but there's a kind of pushback by France. And actually, if you remember that picture about gold, here's what happens next. The gold kind of leaves out of the US and other things are happening there. Now, got to take a detour just to show you something, again, that we really need. And this is entirely for people that have never worked with economics before. But we got to do like 4 slides, basic cross-border accounting. And I'm sorry for this, but you'll never understand securitization unless you understand the fact that the United States has had a current account deficit for 35 years. And that's the foundation stone, the macroeconomic foundation stone of the shadow banking system. Why? Let's see. Okay, so basically, it's just generally true. If we take any bordered area, and actually this works for countries, neighborhoods, even you can draw a line around yourself. And if you think of yourself, you exchange your labor services with the external environment, you receive remittance payments, and you use them to buy imported goods that you consume. Right? It's weird, but works. True for countries, of course, as well. And basically, there's the current account, which is in one direction flow basically trade goods and goods and services. And there's a lot to say there, but we won't worry about it. I got a sentence there about what's in that. And then essentially, it's how much do you buy from abroad versus how much do you sell abroad in accounting in a comprehensive way. And then basically, on the other side are the capital account. Now, basically, if you think of it that, if we are over here and we're the United States and we are trading with, let's say, Japan in the 1980s, and even could be today, and we ship a lot of dollars to Japan, basically to buy Japanese cars, electronics, and other things, Japan is going to ship some dollars back, so to speak, in search of some California goods. But basically, at the end of the day, we'll have a big deficit, current account deficit. They've got, therefore, a capital account surplus. Now, this is important because there's very few equations in economics that actually work. And there's one we're about to get to, which is embodied in that top line. Essentially, Japan now has 2 choices. It can keep the dollars there, or it can use them to buy in assets in my country. It can also sell them to a third party, which in turn makes that investment. But essentially, the dollars either stay abroad or come back in search of assets, since they weren't needed to buy goods. And there's some other, balance sheet stuff there. But basically, here's the equation. X minus M equals, okay, we're just going to call capital inflows, a minus of capital inflow means an outflow. So basically, like Japan would have plus, X minus M plus, and then Japan is building up reserves, and it can do negative outflows, that is to say, it can invest in the US if it wishes. And we can call that foreign savings, and basically we can then turn this into X minus M equals minus SF plus delta R. Delta R is change in reserves. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this and link, so that's just, this equation here is one of our foundational equations just for cross-border balance. That's the one right there. Now what we're going to do is just add, we're going to kind of just take this thing and we're going to go back and play with that same equation we had before, only this time adding basically exports to the possible sources of aggregate demand in our economy. There's now foreigners that can buy our stuff, and then meanwhile, we can buy foreign-made goods, which is imports. So playing around with that, we get to a slightly different equation than we had before, and we can see, just writing that one key part in red, that what we have is essentially merging this with the cross-border balance. We actually rearrange, and we have this kind of problem right here. We get to this master equation. Basically, every country on this earth, and for that matter, every spatial area, has to solve this problem. There's your investment and your government deficit. You either got to pay for it with your people's savings. Now, we can think in a Keynesian way, and there's a discussion there, with foreign savings, or you're going to spend down reserves. That's it. That's your balance. And that's something that essentially is there in every time period. Now, just to say that, what does the IMF want in this frame? That basically the IMF is looking at situations, right, in which basically there is a problem of imbalance. And so essentially there'll be this dependency on foreign savings, which you can see there, which it will perceive as a problem. So essentially, in, like, let's say the case of Greece. So basically what they have to do is to balance their government deficit, their government budget, and then basically we therefore can need to get into a situation where by slowing down our economy and balancing our budget, we can get X minus M or to a different balance than it was before. So either the global growth speeds up, or you slow down, or you cut your budget, or you do all of the above. And the thing is that the IMF will present these choices as technical, again, because it's working with a classical logic that reinforces the idea that all these choices are just technical. That's the cloak behind which all this hides. Now, just to say, this is now, I guess we're going to start part 3. And we're going to talk about basically, why is Minsky's picture here? Okay, because we got just one page here. Okay, so just to say that what I want to do next is just talk a little bit about the beginning of the escape from regulation. And here we've got this, so we're going to go to the 60s and early 70s. And this is a period in which we're going to get right away to Hyman Minsky. Now, we're both going to use and also critique Minsky's ideas. But let's start with where Minsky began. And if we could turn on the board lights for a minute, or not. Basically, oh, there is a board light. Okay, cool. Thank you. So what we have here is basically old school banks that were, in a sense, this would be old banks and small banks. And basically, you would have a balance sheet that would be just cash, and then securities and loans. Now, there's a story about endogenous money that won't bother us today. These loans create a certain amount of deposits, but essentially, we will say that there are deposits, and then there's net worth. In some sense, there's a relationship that regulators maintain between cash and deposits that can discipline a bank. If we look at smaller banks or old-fashioned banks, what we'll see is a certain amount of caution, and actually, usually, they will take some of their spare cash and ship it out through the interbank market, the federal funds market, and keep it with a bigger correspondent bank somewhere else. Now, what happens here in this period of time is that, the financial markets are starting to grow, returns are growing, things are getting more hyped up, the efficient market hypothesis is coming into play. We have James Tobin working with portfolio diversification. The markets are growing, and basically big banks want to find a way to play. They want to expand their capacity. They themselves are servicing firms that are operating in these growing financial markets, and let's call these money center banks in particular, to use the phrase from the day. And what these banks started to do was to come up with a strategy called liability management. And what they would do with liability management is they would basically say, well, okay, we're going to have our cash, and we're going to have some securities, but basically we're going to set a loan target. And we will then assess how much of this our deposit base is going to be able to support. And to the extent that we need more funds, we will supplement that by borrowing money. So we move into a world in which basically we have these banks that are operating in ways that essentially allow them to expand. We'll see a graph, I think, in tomorrow's first lecture, or maybe second, that lays this out. But basically, they're expanding on the expectation that they want and need to grow, and they'll do that by borrowing funds that are not native to their own institution. They'll go into the money markets or wherever they need to go. Now, a game emerges in the 1960s and 70s, which inspires Minsky's financial fragility hypothesis. And the game, so there's a part of it is the game of securities markets and what's happening there, but the other part is a game that's played by the big banks. What they do is basically they're willing to take on, now this gets a little bit into what Amit was talking about earlier, got default risk over here, the fact that the loans might go bad, and they got liquidity risk over here, which is the fact that they're supporting a longer-term position, classically, with shorter-term liabilities, the cost of which could rise whilst these might be locked in. In that case, they would actually have to possibly fund their position at a penalty and take a hit on their bottom line. And it's a classic dilemma always in financial crises is this a solvency problem or is this a liquidity problem? Is it a temporary thing where basically this institution's cash flow is going down because it's just got unexpectedly high borrowing costs, or is the whole portfolio garbage and actually this is going to be an insolvent institution? Because basically, as this, there's two reasons why you could lose net worth and become insolvent. One is that you're bleeding cash flow because your borrowed funds cost more than you're making here. That's going to be the problem with the savings and loans in that crisis that we'll get to. Or the other problem could be that you've got bad loans, and as you declare loan losses and have to take them, basically it's going to erase a part of your net worth. So that's something that basically Minsky is working with as his scenario of recurrent financial crises. And that leads him to his financial instability hypothesis. So he comes up with this thing in the early 70s, writes his John Maynard Keynes in 75, writes and rewrites. And the thing that you have to realize about Minsky is that he was really focused on the US economic experience. If you look at his Stabilizing the Unstable Economy book, 1986, which is the one most people often look at these days, look in the back and look up the word Latin America, you will find 0 references. Or look up Asia or any part of the world, Africa. He wasn't interested in that. And now I just mentioned Latin America because in 1982 you have the Latin American debt crisis, which would be the subject we'll cover in lecture number 2 tomorrow morning. But basically he's thinking about the US case. And he's proposing this idea that essentially stability is destabilizing, that essentially, and I will get into this in a minute here, recognizing that basically all firms must position themselves to finance their position so that any given firm is going to have its cash and some other, some inventory and other things. Basically then plant and equipment, P plus E. So it's going to have its asset position and it's going to have to finance this basically as it can, but basically it will have working capital loans, and then it might have bonds, or equity shares that finance it in a variety of ways. We'll see a picture for the US case. In the US, this is about 1/3, 3-to-1 leveraging here at the present time. So basically, he's got this vision of the fact that essentially what's going to happen with firms is that they're going to start incrementing their plant and equipment. They're going to start investing. And as they, more, because in good times, they're going to want to expand, expand, expand. And as they do that, they're going to basically surpass their available cash flow. They won't be able to fund it out of their own profits, goes the story. They'll have to increasingly borrow. And as they increasingly borrow, they're taking on debt obligations. And the thing about debt obligations, as opposed to spending down your cash or doing equity financing, is that debt obligations lock you into interest payments that are basically insensitive, in most cases, to the state of the cycle. So essentially, you take on a financially fragile investment position so as to fund your expansion, and sooner or later, you're going to get into trouble when you outpace yourself. Now, he's actually got a kind of neo-Marxian version of competition there built into he's imagining firms competing for market share, competing to exceed each other. And actually, if you think of a lot of cases, it makes a certain amount of sense. I think of the automobile market in Latin America, for example, where I think no fewer than 4 countries are trying to position themselves as the chief supplier of automobiles for a booming Latin American market. Now, of course, everybody's in trouble, but that's the kind of thing that happens. Now, I think I'm going to probably not have time to talk about the linkage, the kind of way in which Minsky, now, one thing you have to know about Minsky, he's called a rebel. And there's a lot of celebration about the weird, one thing about Minsky, he wore that sweater every time I ever saw him. So like he was like this old guy who was walking around, and he would say things like, I would go there in the early 80s, I guess it was, early, was it 90s, when he was at the levee, and he'd walk around and say, like, Dymski, what's the model of the model? And then he'd walk away, and you'd be like, huh? And that would be your question for a seminar later in the day. So he was that guy. But Minsky wanted to be loved. He wanted to be embraced. He wanted the mainstream to love him. He was always bringing in people such as myself or Fazari or Randall Wray at the time, people like that. But then he would bring in people like Calamiris and others, Hubbard, and at the same time for these summer seminars, hoping that we, the heterodox, enlightened people, could convince them that Minsky's instability hypothesis was the thing. So the fact that he basically goes and uses Tobin's theory Q, which is basically an arbitrage theory of investment based on efficient financial markets, it's not a happy linkage, but it's not a surprising choice. I remember, there was just a strange story. There was one point where Jim Crotty and Minsky closed the door after a seminar at UMass, and Crotty wanted to talk. I was like the privileged listener, grad student, and basically Crotty went after Minsky and said, "Hi, you have no theory of investment. Like, this can't be. You're Mr. Financial Instability. You got no theory of investment. What's up with that?" Minsky really didn't want to hear it, and there was one point in the conversation where Crotty said, "Hi, we're Marxists, and we're the only people that understand you. So, deal with it." It was a really interesting moment. But that ambiguity in Minsky was there all the time. And thus we have some ambiguities in his theoretical exposition. We do have the sense in which he never links up with other theories of accumulation, etc. He told me the last time I saw him, Riverside, West Coast tour, it was clear he was dying. I said, you better, any question you have, you want to ask Minsky, you better do it right now. So I asked him, "Hi, why is there no labor in your model?" Story he told said, well, I grew up in the 50s when there was red baiting and communist hating and all that in the US. He was a diaper baby, right? He was from a communist family. And so they would have somehow been oppressed. And he said, I wanted a model of capitalist crisis where you couldn't blame labor. Right? Well, if you have a model where there's no labor, then that's going to work. And if you look at that famous 1957 article, you'll see there it is. Now, the way this thing works is here's a typical firm, and basically we have this micro dimension. So imagine the firm is maximizing profits. So just for simplicity, imagine there's we got a real simple framework here. We got basically there's an interest rate R they got to pay on their D, on their debt. They've got the debt and they basically rented their K, their capital. And the K capital is going to be sold at PK. And the price that will achieve is either a high price or a low price. And there's a probability of a high price and a probability of a low price. Now this contradicts, Keynesian uncertainty, but just for expositing, basically the question is, do you have enough cash flow to pay for your debt? That's a Minskian question. And essentially, there's three positions. And so there's your K, and there's your D. So you're funding your K with your D. And basically, the way it goes is the following, that there's three states of being. And it's not that there's like Ponzi units that are out there, just bad Ponzi units, but basically that any unit can overexpand itself into an overstretched financial position. So what we have here is basically in the beginning, everything is good. We have a strong cash flow. We can pay for either a very bad or a very good outcome on our capital, on our investment. A middle case is where if we have a good outcome for our investment, we can pay off and meet our capital expense, our debt expense. If we have a bad outcome, we're going to be short. But a Ponzi case would be the case where basically we don't have enough cash flow to cover our position. And so essentially, Ponzi units are like this. Let me skip this picture here, just to say that there's caution exerted. But the idea that's really built up here is just the notion that in the good times, essentially the firm at the top turns into the firm at the bottom. Now the difference between the two is that the firm at the bottom has taken on a lot more green credit, a lot more green debt, so as to expand its position. That's the idea, is that you're expanding and therefore taking on more risk. Basically, let's just say here that he's got this strange theory of investment. Let me skip this one too, just because it's not that, I don't want to engage with the problematic here. It's kind of interesting because you're going to hear a lot about theories of arbitrage and derivatives later, but basically Minsky gets it wrong. So let's move on. And what he gives us is a picture of boom and bust. And here's one iconic picture of that, imagination of that, where basically the macroeconomy rolls up. We have the capacity utilization is growing more and more. Output growth is growing. Basically firms competing to get in on the action are experiencing the fact that the PKPI, that's okay, so PKPI, that's the ratio of the stock price compared to the price it costs to really put your capital in place. So like over here would be basically the cost, the actual cost of expanding your plant capacity. In a good time, basically the idea would be that whatever that is, that PI, that the PK, the valuation of your firm would be higher than that in the capital markets, so you're incentivized to go forward and take on more debt. As you do, you reach a point where suddenly the market peaks, and then you're stuck with debt, and there's what Marx would have called the slaughter of capital. So basically, I'm going to skip the next part too about banks for the minute, just in the interest of time. Basically, he's got ideas about, in banks too, let me just make one simple point about banks, are fragile units. As we see firms, with asset positions that are essentially dependent on debt, we've already actually just seen that banks too are in the position where they have asset positions they've got to finance. So there's a certain parallel there. And the banks in turn will basically paralleling the firms from the top down to the bottom will expand and take on more loans, supporting more investment and taking on more borrowing. And that will lead to a situation in which basically, in principle, we should have to some extent, a self-moderating system. We should imagine that as banks are seeing that their customers are getting less creditworthy, they should pull back on their loans and they should then exert caution. And in turn, the central bank, if there's any doubts about the viability of the banking system, should stand prepared rather than allowing the borrowed fund market to go out of control. The central bank should stand prepared to basically pump a lot of liquidity into the system, driving down the borrowed funds rate, and therefore easing the burden on the banks. And in fact, the idea that Minsky has is the idea that when this whole system gets into trouble, we need two things to solve it. One thing is we need what he calls the big bank. And the big bank is basically the central bank that's going to come in and reduce the squeeze on borrowed funds, let the system flow, basically emit liquidity without limit, reassuring the markets that basically it's not worth running in fear from the financial system because the financial system is being supported. Now notice that this is a very US-centric view of things, but this is Minsky's view. So big bank can solve things, and then what should happen next is big government should come in, and big government should basically take this stagnating economy with these firms that are in trouble, build up some aggregate demand, and then pull this economy back into growth, permitting this firm to stop having useless investment that's costing at borrowed rates that are unviable, because the bond rate should fall because of the bank intervention, and then this plant and equipment should be viable. So we'll now make profits again, and we'll go forward in a Schumpeterian fashion. Hold that thought. He, again, keep in mind that he's working in the U.S. in the golden age, so-called golden age, where there's very regular cycles. So in his head, the world works this way. And he's also kind of informed by the early century tradition on business cycles, Schumpeter and other people. But actually, at the end of today's lecture, I'm going to show you the last slides, how the world changed. This formula, big bank, big government, really breaks down in the neoliberal period. Yeah. Oh, the question is, how does does big government or big bank worry about inflationary pressures? At a moment like this, you throw aside your concerns about inflation. Your concern is with saving your financial system. And in a sense, that's the idea here is that, and that he's also in that part of the golden age of capitalism that believes that Oken's law holds, that you have to absorb a certain amount of inflation in order to secure constant growth. You'll see that again in the slides I'll show you at the end. But basically, if you compare like these three units across time and space, so there's non-financial firms, households, and banks, relatively accurate balance sheets. Essentially, his thing is you intervene here because basically these are the institutions that are the most leveraged and therefore the most vulnerable. And you basically, by stabilizing these guys, these banks, you stabilize the rest of the system. Now, again, thinking with the era in which he did, let's skip these next two on that. We're going to go to part 5. We've got 2 parts left, and we'll see if we get through. Because basically, he was in an era in which inflation was not a concern for lots of reasons that actually we're about to explore the breakdown of. So if we take a look here, balance of payments problems, as noted, industrial renewal, the Vietnam War, rentier behavior by US multinational corporations, lots of stuff happening by the end of the 60s into the 70s that's causing a slowdown or a breakdown of pieces of this. There is even, in fact, capital controls that are imposed by the Kennedy administration in 1963. The Fed is trying to slow down the economy at different points in ways that I was mentioning. That the Fed is, on the one hand, the Federal Reserve, on the one hand, prepared to play its big bank role in a crisis period, but the Federal Reserve is also trying to slow down the pace of expansion of the economy, in part by basically allowing borrowed funds to become more costly as it sees a period, a danger period coming, or else cutting off access to borrowed funds markets. That was something that they were trying to do. The banks, the big banks, would then find new sources of borrowed funds. So this kind of game that's being played where the Fed is losing control of the money center banks, whilst at the same time the US economy is going worse. And basically, there's a really interesting article by Kindleberger, Desprez, and Salant in 1966 in The Economist magazine, basically arguing that the US current account deficit is not a problem because it's actually just solving the world's liquidity problem. But nobody buys it. They also say, we've got the finest financial markets in the world, so don't you need us? But basically, the confidence-based system, the dollar's as good as gold, was breaking down, and this model crashes and burns when we get to basically the situation of the 1970s. The value is clearly overvalued. The gold is leaking out of the country. President Nixon takes panicky steps. He suspends the convertibility of the dollar into gold in 71. He imposes capital wage price controls to win re-election, and then ends the peg of the dollar to gold in 73. The age of hegemony of the US, the golden age, lasts just 25 years. And basically, we now enter a period of supply-side shocks and destabilization of banks and so on. Price inflation is going to rise tremendously, and basically, we're going to end with the creation of a dramatic series of moves at the end of the 70s that are going to launch us, come hell or high water, into the neoliberal era where we are still living. But basically, here is the events, these are the events that in part trigger the downturn and the collapse of the system of the world economy. Now notice that basically Breton Woods system ends whilst oil prices are still low. But basically, those of you who are too young to have lived through it won't remember this, but it was a horrible time in which basically a world that had been used to very cheap oil found the price of oil quadrupling because of the Arab oil embargo linked around the Yom Kippur War. We then had the Iranian Revolution, which leads to the more than doubling of oil prices some years later. What this does, these are economies that had been living in happy, blissful, low inflation conditions for many years. Remember what was happening at that time was that you had all these Keynesian models that were econometric models, big models like 800 equations, 900 equations, DRI, Penn, Wharton, etc., that were all optimized on data that goes from, now this goes to Kuznets's creation of macro accounts, 1948 quarterly data through the present. But most of that data series, those data series are running through those golden age years where you have no supply side shocks. What do you think happens to econometric models optimized and backward looking on those conditions when you ask them to make predictions about the future? Of course, they look like garbage, and in-period estimation and production is just no good, which opens the door, right, for the critique of the Keynesians by Lucas and the Neoclassicals. How foolish they are Do they think people are so easily fooled? Now, that goes to show you, though, the way the game was played. It's set up as a problem of, imagining that people are fooled. Oh, no, I don't know. How about the fact that there's conflict in the Middle East and conflicts in Iran that are profound and serious? Never enters the macro model. It's just a game played at a different level for different purposes. Nonetheless, incredible destabilization. There's a picture of UK inflation out of control, profitability down in those years, and basically the system goes into crisis. Now, at this point, I got to say, how many people here have read Yanis Varoufakis' book, the Global Minotaur? Okay, because Yanis, he's a friend, and he got some quotes in his book from some conversations we had. So the next part's going to look familiar to you. I showed him this article. He couldn't believe it. But so we were sitting around talking in 2009, I guess. But so here's the situation of U.S. interest rates, and notice the problems here. Basically, again, reflecting, here's the cost of borrowing funds, out of control, and short-term funds equal to or higher than longer-term borrowing funds. And, just a terrible situation. And Paul Volcker is made the chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, Paul, basically, in the previous winter, now keep in mind that Volcker was the guy at the New York Fed who negotiated the end of Breton Woods, right? So he understood the global scenario. And for his sins, right, he's came back under the Dodd-Frank thing. But basically, he writes this essay some months before he takes power in the Fed and writes the following things. The political economy of the dollar. It is tempting to look at the market as an impartial arbiter, but balancing the requirements of a stable international system against the desirability of retaining freedom of action for national policy, a number of countries, including the US, opted for the latter. Now, the past tense there is interesting. Is he talking about Breton Woods, perhaps? But the next sentence is chilling. A controlled disintegration of the world economy is a legitimate objective for the 1980s. Now, is he a monetarist? Is he a pro-rentier capitalist class supporter? Is he a guy who liked to play God? Is he all of the above? He's the chairperson of the Fed. And basically, that sentence there leads to the following scenario. So here we have the reproducing. Now let's see what Mr. Volcker does. Now, that's a heck of a shock right there. And basically, one of the things that happens immediately is that it restores the value of the dollar. Now, we're going to talk, and one of the things that this does is actually give us what will be the first topic for tomorrow morning, which is basically the Latin American debt crisis. Now, when we talk about the Latin American debt crisis, we're going to instantly go to something that Dr. Badauri was being questioned and giving some discourse about, the asymmetric information approach to understanding how credit markets work. Because you're going to see the ways in which basically people in the economics fraternity, rather than talk about these things, like these things, and the impact on the short-term borrowing rates, since, for example, the debt of Mexico was largely financed with variable rate loans and or short-term loans. And so, this has, and notice what happens to the dollar as well. So when you're looking at 1982, for example, when Mexico is going to default, you're looking at a trajectory like this, and you just saw what happened to interest rates. So suddenly you're facing payback in a foreign currency that's rocketing out of sight with high interest rates in the currency you have to pay back. Is it any surprise that you default? Not really, and it has a lot to do with the global positioning of everything. But that is denied and written out of history. We're not interested in history if we're doing economics. And so that's something that we basically say, we have to reconsider. Now, the last part of today's lecture, I'm just going to take you through, I kind of hurried through, I have an article in the Cambridge Journal of Economics that has this kind of critique about how Minsky doesn't get banking, or banks work differently than he said. We'll get into a little bit of it, that we didn't need to foreshadow it. But what I do want to do for the rest of our time, and it'll leave us a little bit of time for discussion, is just to say that essentially Minsky's sitting there writing, and keep in mind now he's writing and he's got his mind focused. He's in St. Louis, Missouri, right, in middle of the United States. He's focused on the U.S. economy, and for example, he writes a book and an article. I guess the article is 1981, and then the book is 1983, I believe, entitled "It Didn't Happen Again." It's Challenge Magazine. Basically saying, well, yeah, everything was all right. It could have, but it didn't. And his point was that big bank and big government took care of these problems, and that we learned, so to speak, how to stabilize the unstable economy. Now, actually, so let's just go with Minsky for the minute, and in a sense, see some of the limitations of a purely Keynesian view. Now, if Keynes is somebody who strips the social aspect of distribution out of his model, and who takes the material conditions of reproduction out of his model, notice that that's exactly what we were working with Amit. We were sitting there looking at the investment sector and the consumption goods sector and how they exchange. We're talking about materiality, the way the economy works. And that's something that Minsky strips out of his vision. But he goes even further in stripping labor out of the thing, but has this faith that basically the central bank, with a benign counter-cyclical spending government, can save the economy from its cyclical downturns. Okay, now basically, I did an experiment with Poland, Bob Poland, one of my good friends in econ, and we did this first running through 1980s, and then I subsequently updated it a couple of times just to see what would happen. So this is going to take, there's a little bit of investment here, but basically you're going to be looking at a number of charts that have a similar structure. So let's kind of look at this and make sure it's going to make sense for you. Now, Minsky talks about the difference. His view was that, we learned something. We set up the Keynesian welfare state and the Keynesian, the proper Federal Reserve after the Depression, and we learned how to do it, how to avoid depression. And so essentially the small government era. Now what we did is we took data from 1875 to the present. Because it was so old, we had to use annual data, and we strip out war years and so on. But what we do is we come up with enough cycles that we got some data that we could work with. We then take basically, so this is year by year. Year zero is the year where your economy is going into the tank. We're going down. So trough to, toward peak. Actually, we're not sure where the peak comes. Basically, I would drop the data as if the economy went down again, I would pull it out. So there'd be only maybe 3 observations or 4. But if we go as long as the data would permit us to go, just tracking what happens in different business cycles. Now we're then comparing 1875 through basically, I think it was 1932. Now notice that essentially GDP growth, when you have a recession, you really go down hard, and then you recover and so on. Now the big government era, which we call basically from the 30s, now again stripping out the war years, so really more like the 50s through the end of the 70s, notice that the downturn is almost nil. You almost completely get rid of your loss, and then you have a kind of smoother, if less spectacular growth. But then let's look at the rest of the story. The 1980s, you got a very big, now when Bob and I looked at that, we said, well, that looks a lot more like the classical era than anything else. But then let's look at the 90 to 96, and then let's look at the 2000 to 2006, and so on. We could add more recent one. But what we were starting to see was that basically the economy was really behaving differently than Minsky had expected it to be. It wasn't looking like we were still in the big government era. We appeared to be in a new era. Now here is unemployment rate. Now here is your basically, here you are, you go into recession. Unemployment rate climbs, climbs, climbs for a long time in the small government era. That's the kind of bad old days. And here's Minsky's idea of, here's the big government era, where you dampen that rise in unemployment and you smooth it and you prevent this kind of social loss of people out of work. Now you absorb that in exchange for some inflation. Hold that thought, I think it's the next graph. But basically look at, by contrast, here's 81 and 96, or 87, doesn't look like that. The 90s don't look like that. And the 2000s don't really look like that. It's kind of flat. In fact, when I ask the data statistically, basically, when I ask those data series, using just some kind of standard mean and squared errors type of thing, data from the post-1980s, who do you want to group with? Those data want to be a group. They want to be an era. So you could call that the era of neoliberal era. But basically, here's your price inflation thing. Now, so basically, here's the old days. You start with some kind of inflationary peak, and then boom, you go into deflation. Here, by contrast, here's the price you're going to pay for stimulating your economy so as to do big government. So the economy wanted to tank, but you prevent that. You basically set up a series of, so whereas that old picture of Minsky was like, the economy would go like this and this. Instead, in a way, what you do in his idea of the new cycle is you go like this, and you arrest it, and then you should go like this, arrest it, and go like this, paying an inflationary price all the time. But that's what the world he was hoping to have achieved, and that's the world we're seeing slipping away there. Notice that price inflation doesn't have anything to do with anything in those last three cycles. That looks a heck of a lot like global factory and like a different kind of setups coming in. Basically, we then have something like the emergence of the neoliberal era. Welcome to the desert of the real, right? So we have basically vastly reduced government expenditures. We'll see that in a minute. The real wage is not going to do much to restore anything. The profit rate isn't going to, be much affected. And so we see kind of these limits on what Minsky thought. There's not a quick fix. There's this interaction, and this really goes to the kind of thoughts that we were seeing and listening to Dr. Badauri. We're in some kind of a new era where things are moving differently, and I'm going to really push this tomorrow in terms of I'm going to link the emergence of the U.S. from its neoliberal era crisis. In fact, Thatcher and Reagan, right, initiate that era by taking on the traffic controllers in the US and the coal miners in Britain, breaking those unions, and then basically instituting a new era of labor relations and so on. And basically the tame world that Minsky was hoping we would live in was already gone. By the time he writes his 1986 book, that world is history. Now, Hyde kind of knew it. Again, those conversations I mentioned where he was bringing in these neoclassicals into the levee were early 90s. And, Minsky, if you look at a 1996 article he writes in the Journal of Economic Issues that talks about money manager capitalism, he's starting to feel the shape of this new problem, but he never really gets there. Now, we'll end with a couple of pictures that come from, that again just describe what's different about the era. Now here's big government spending. Now here you go. Here's countercyclical, spending on individuals, right? So that's countercyclical spending, goes way up after a recession, and basically, stays peaked for a while. But basically, we don't see that pattern much. It's erratic. Oh, see, there's the big government there. The peaks are less high, and it's much more erratic, the kind of spending that we do see. And so, that's broken down. And then I've got two more, I think, maybe more than that. Let me see. Oh, I've got two more in the final slide. Here's your wage and salary payments thing. Okay, so here we go. In big government era, basically notice the stability of wage payments. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you made the observation, talking to Dr. Badauri, the last question, was it the decline in wages that induces the financialization, or is it financialization that induces? Now notice here, look what happens to wages in these three periods. Basically, they go in the tank. You go down and you stay down in the 2006. You don't really come out of it that much. The story is much the same in the most recent business cycle, but basically you don't have that smoothness at all. It's really a break of pattern. And then this one here, the manufacturing profit rate. Again, notice that there's almost no impact on manufacturing profits in the big government era of those activities. Neutral. But by contrast, you see, a lot of changes, and you can see, could you imagine that this is somehow linked to those reductions in wages? Yeah, perhaps. One would think that that might be part of it, because we're moving into a different era. So final slide. I'm not saying that Minsky is obsolete. To the contrary, quite the contrary. We're in an era of financial instability, big time. And in fact, this remains a defining feature of this era. But how it plays out, we've got to think differently. And we especially have to keep in mind that we have to convert Minsky's ideas into a cross-border context, into a context in which every nation is not a hegemon, able to issue all the currency it wants, when it wants, where it wants, in the amounts it wants, without fear of deflation or inflation, of devaluation or inflation. And basically, we have this world that's a much less safe world in which basically there is a search for security. And ironically, and this irony will be my last point today, and a point said very well by Barry Eichengreen in his book that's entitled Exorbitant Privilege, in which he's discussing the kind of curious fate of the US dollar. He's kind of asking a question, how is it that a nation, and we'll see a picture, I think tomorrow, well, it's got to be tomorrow, but I forget which lecture, I think it's number 2 tomorrow. How is it that a nation that has this consistent current account deficit, a sign of weakness, can basically retain the value of its currency? Well, it has something to do with petrodollar recycling and the commitment of the petroleum exporting nations to using the dollar in order to make payments. That's a piece of it. But another piece of it is basically that the US remains a safe haven despite all breakdowns and crises in the rest of the world. We're going to look at some of the data tomorrow on financial crises and see that there are more and more such crises, and that basically in that context, the more crises there are, the safer the US looks, given what I'm going to argue is this hegemonic advantage that it has. Now, I'm going to introduce a concept tomorrow, post-hegemonic hegemony. Now, it's going to require some nuance, but the idea is you're not, so if you think of the idea of hegemony as introduced by Kindleberger, and actually you saw Kindleberger there, we the US, we're giving the world a gift. Here's our advanced financial markets. Here's the global liquidity you all need. Thank you very much. I'm Charles Kindleberger. And the hegemon is a giver. And here what I'm saying is, I would say the post-hegemonic hegemon is a taker. It's not securing it's not bringing about the security in the rest of the world. It's no longer its concern. Instead, it's basically out for itself and has the capacity to protect itself. In fact, the more it uses that capacity, the more the unstable calculus of geopolitical events plays into the hands of those who won't take on serious structural reform, in the United States case at least, and that won't open up to a serious global dialogue on the responsibility of the formerly hegemonic nation for seeing the world through to a new age and era. And as you know, at the present time, we have people running for president of the United States that make us remember the phrase of the Bible. I think it goes something like this: "Woe unto thee, O Israel, when thy king is a boy." And we have children running for the United States president, selfish children, and with the world needs much better than that. So let's hope that we don't at least get afflicted with that. But basically, we have now, at this point, and tomorrow we'll pick up the story, we're prepared for the age of mass securitization. As noted, it's linked into this global situation, and it gives us the final escape of finance. If finance was kind of the money center banks wanting to break out of their cage, we're going to see these banks break right off the page. Not only that, but we're going to see them become too big to fail. And it might interest you to know that not only did the Volcker, let's say, episode of interest rate increases lead to high interest rates that destroyed the Mexican economy and led to the debt crisis in Latin America, it also brought about the savings and loan crisis and a crisis of commercial banking, one consequence of which was the emergence of a situation in which basically finance now escapes and creates a world in which it buttresses its own position, and its leading figures become too big to fail. And that policy, too big to fail policy, is established in 1983. So stay tuned. We'll pick up that story tomorrow. All right, thanks for your attention.